Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Tracy Glenn, and I'm one of the organizers of the Human Rights and Media Lecture Series, being brought to you by the Atlantic Human Rights Center, St. Thomas University's Department of Human Rights, St. Thomas University's Department of Journalism and Communications, the MD Media Co-op, and Raven, Rural Action and Voices for the Environment. So I want to begin by acknowledging that myself and the organizers for today's lecture are on the stolen territories of the Wolastoqey, Passamaquoddy, and the Mi'kmaq. And these lands are bound by the Peace and Friendship Treaties signed between the British Crown and the Indigenous peoples of the Wabanagi region from 1725 to 1779. The treaties of peace and friendship did not involve the Indigenous peoples of these lands ceding or surrendering any land. Rather, the treaties established terms of peaceful coexistence, recognizing Indigenous peoples of the region as sovereign. So this winter, the Human Rights and Media Lecture Series will discuss timely events in relation to the media. We'll hear from scholars of the media and the law, as well as journalists, other media makers, lawyers, grassroots activists on how our media landscape is changing. And these speakers will tell us what they are doing to make our media landscape a more safe, just, and equal space. So the talks happen at 5:30 Atlantic time here on Zoom. We have two talks left. You can use the same Zoom link that you're using now, and you can find out more about the series by visiting the MD Media Co-op website or Facebook page, or by visiting St. Thomas University's events webpage at stu.ca. So all the talks, or most of the talks, will be made available days after the talks on the MD Media Co-op website, and this one will be at mdmediacoop.org. So this series is made possible with many hands. So I do want to thank especially Aditya Rao with the Atlantic Human Rights Center and the MD Media Co-op, Shannon Brooke Murphy with the Atlantic Human Rights Center and the Department of Human Rights at St. Thomas University, Amanda DiPaolo, the chair of the Department of Human Rights at STU, Jamie Gillies, the chair of the Department of Journalism and Communications at STU, Susan O'Donnell with Raven, and Ashlyn Albright, Jacqueline Cormier, and Angela Bossi at STU Communications for helping promote the series. So before turning it over to Susan O'Donnell, who will introduce our speaker, Dr. Fenwick McKelvey this evening, I wanted to quickly announce the next speaker in our series. So on Thursday, March 31st, same time, Siti Maimuna, a colleague of mine, a longtime colleague, she was a rapporteur for the People's Tribunal at COP26 in Glasgow that happened back in November. She's going to be speaking about being the media at COP26 and what a green energy transition means for Indonesia, and talking about the climate crisis in Indonesia and reporting on it. So I'll turn it over to Susan O'Donnell, who will introduce our speaker tonight.
Thank you, Tracy. Great. Okay. So I'm my name's Susan O'Donnell, and I'm just looking for my slide here. And I'm an adjunct professor at St. Thomas University in the Environment and Society program, and I'm also the lead investigator of the Raven project at the University of New Brunswick. And I'm very pleased to introduce my colleague, Dr. Fenwick McKelvey. Fenwick is an associate professor in Information and Communication Technology Policy in the Department of Communication Studies at Concordia University in Montreal, and Fenwick is from St. John. He studies digital politics and policy. He's the author of a book called Internet Demons, Digital Communications Possessed. I love that title, from the University of Minnesota Press 2018, which was the winner of the 2019 Gertrude J. Robinson Book Award, which honors the best in Canadian communications scholarship. He's the co-author of another book, The Permanent Campaign, New Media and New Politics by Peter Lang, 2012, with Greg Elmer and Ganel Langlois. I've known Fenwick for about 15 years. We met when he was starting graduate school in Toronto, and I was working at the National Research Council of Canada here in Fredericton. We had lots to discuss as we had common research interests, and we ended up working together for a while, and we traveled together to a remote fly-in Indigenous community in Northwestern Ontario for a study on digital communications technologies in remote communities, and we co-wrote an article together. So very fond memories of that, Fenwick. As well as having a curious and brilliant mind, he's an interesting and fun person to be with, and I'm so pleased that he agreed to be part of our webinar series. And today, Fenwick will be talking about how artificial intelligence is shaping our lives and our communications. So over to you, Fenwick.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Susan, and everybody for having me today. I will be brief because maybe but I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for Susan O'Donnell, for being one of the first people who introduced me to the field and brought me in and was so kind with the mentorship and scholarship. And so it's a real privilege and honor to be able to kind of give back in this moment, and also to see her again. It's far too long. So I just, as an initial start, I just want to say a profound debt of gratitude and thanks, which I'll mention. And with that, I will, compose myself and say that it's a real privilege and pleasure to be here. So yeah, as Susan mentioned, my name is Fenwick McKelvey, and I'm originally from St. John, New Brunswick, and I'm actually quite happy to be here today. The rest of my family is at the St. Patrick's Society dinner of St. John, which continues to be an all-male dinner. So I'm very glad to be at a more progressive event that's open to the public. And although I miss my family, I'm very thankful to be able to be sharing St. Patrick's Day with you today. So let me just start to share my screen and to be able to begin my talk. Everybody can see the slides? Wonderful. So before I'd like to begin, I'd also like to acknowledge that Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Kanakahage Nation is recognized as the custodians on the lands and the waters on which we gather today. Tiohtià:ke, or Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. And I'll say a particular thing that I'm greatly thankful for is that at Concordia University at the Milieu Institute, there's also the Indigenous Futures program led by Jason Lewis. And that part of my own work has really been enlivened and enriched by his own discussions and dialogue. And I encourage folks to check out their Indigenous Protocols and Artificial Intelligence position paper. And I'll share a link as soon as I figure out how to do that and present at the same time. But it's a really welcome and recommended piece kind of linking this up. And what I'd like to do today is talk about some of my work I'm doing around artificial intelligence and questions of democracy and governance. And so my hope here is kind of introduce you to the kind of state of what's happening in this move to, and I think this tremendous investment in artificial intelligence as a solution to societal problems. And that's a tension I want to unpack, and I'll walk through that presentation and talk. As a way of introduction, let me just say that artificial intelligence is not something to think about as a far off concept or something that's far on the horizon, but something that we very much live with and are working with today. The Canadian Revenue Association, in talking about what are its directions in the future and how it intends to advance its read and auditing of finance files, mentions artificial intelligence as one of the directions it's looking for. Now, I highlight this connection between the Canada Revenue Agency and its potential interest in artificial intelligence because in the United States, we see the potential consequences of that clear bias in moving towards automation. The Internal Revenue Service in the United States has found that it's simply easier and more cost-effective to audit poor tax evaders than sophisticated rich tax evaders, and which speaks to me about a clear bias that I would highlight is something quite seminal in the work. In the studies of artificial intelligence, the ways that there might be a clear bias in how these technologies are able to solve problems and what problems they're able to solve. And I'm happy to answer questions. I'm blanking on the name of the book that I wanted to recommend here, but I would recommend, there's a lot of really great scholarship on this. Automating Inequality, Virginia Eubanks is like the book I wanted to mention. And what I want to say in this talk is then, well, how does power operate? How might we think of this consequence of regulation done through artificial intelligence? And what are using the example of the IRS, potential problems or limitations was this turn towards using artificial intelligence as a way of solving our societal problems. And what I found in my own work is kind of two central issues. One is a question quite fundamentally and quite relevant to Canada about oversight, how we're able to understand whether artificial intelligence is being used and how, and a subsequent question about this idea of solutionism. And this is a term we might have encountered before, but this idea that technology can solve these problems. And we find a persistent phenomenon that artificial intelligence is part of this continuation of using technology to solve societal problems. And so what I'd like to do in this talk is talk a little bit about who I am and where I'm coming from in terms of this problem, describe what is the AI situation in Canada, and then talk about two cases, Bell AI and online harms, particularly because these are live cases that I hope that as an audience you might know is taking place and be able to think about ways of participating. Now, I'd also like to highlight that the research that I'm presenting is not mine alone. It's a collaboration. Just posting the link. Collaboration between a number of different SSHRC-funded projects. It's co-led by my co-PI, Jonathan Roberge, and these are some of the excellent, amazing arrays and researchers that are helping me work through these ideas. So very much when I'm presenting today is that collaborative effort. Very, very proud that this is something that is a shared joint project in these discussions. So first off, who am I? So as I said, I'm originally from St. John, New Brunswick, and this is important to me because I was born and raised, as Tracy mentioned, on the Wolastoq and the unceded territory of the Wolastoq MLC peoples, and this is something that it's been a long journey for me to kind of understand and be able to talk through, and this is one of the things that I'm kind of deeply thankful for Susan O'Donnell and Brian Lewis for putting me on this path of understanding Indigenous peoples in Canada, and their generosity in helping me is, I think, central and part of how I'm, see how I've learned in my learning journey. And I also would like to acknowledge Andrea Bear-Nichols, whose piece on malice dispossession was kind of really central. It was talking about an art piece that hung in my grandparents' cottage, and so both these pieces are really helpful in me kind of understanding where I'm from and the kind of my own journey. And I always like to joke that in St. John, I was a power meter reader, which is arguably one of, if not the best job, one of the best jobs I ever had in my life. So what I did was going door to door, looking at people's houses for the meter on the side of your house. And once you start looking for them, you can never miss them. The power meters are something which is part of our built-in urban environment. And so here's the St. John Energy, which I was part of. And in retrospect and looking back at my job, I always find it kind of funny because I was part of something that we now talk in academia about infrastructure. What is the built environment? All those boring things that we don't really pay attention to. And that is being a power meter reader, I was infrastructure. And that infrastructure and that interest in infrastructure and that kind of fun I had understanding how the power system works is something that stays with me and carries with me as I study now kind of questions of media infrastructure. And in particular, my work is an intersection of three different questions. One, this idea of media infrastructure. Two, how media infrastructure is regulated, so the politics and policies of media infrastructure. This goes back to some of my work on the Videocom project with Susan O'Donnell, talking about Indigenous infrastructures in Northern Ontario, as well as, I think, more recently, about trying to understand the consequences of the introduction of intelligences, artificial machine intelligences, into these media infrastructures. And that's what I'd like to kind of begin and continue to talk. And so that's really was the subject of my first book, Internet Demons, which for those who don't know, the cover is actually super weird, but this is billions of packets being visualized, which I always kind of liked the gaze of as the early internet art. But the part of the book was talking through this turn towards embedding intelligence in a communication system, the internet, and how that intelligence has had consequences. And so that's something that I'm carrying forward in this project now. And this has really kind of brought me to a question of this relationship between AI and infrastructure. Because artificial intelligence is now part of the change, the rebuilding and reformatting of our digital society, our digital infrastructures. And so just as a beginning to talk about what do we mean by artificial intelligence. I think there's two ways to tell the story of artificial intelligence. One, this is a very kind of particular story about different lineages of symbolic versus connectionist approaches to artificial intelligence. And folks might be familiar with often what's used the term deep learning, machine learning. This is a recent term popularized by certain kind of developments in artificial intelligence that has led to the kind of current popularity or interest, and that algorithms can be trained with massive data sets and large energy resources to be able to be built as models that can make, increasingly effective ways of predicting or creating content. And so that is a kind of narrow definition of artificial intelligence. And part of it, to me, in looking at this history, is realizing that people, of all folks, researchers alike, use artificial intelligence loosely. And so I'd also say that the second reading of artificial intelligence, which is a very broad term, and I invite everybody to kind of use that, because artificial intelligence is a big tent to talk about the ways that things other than humans are intelligent and have agency in systems, particularly media systems. And so that's the definition I'm working on this talk, the ways that there's kind of artificial intelligence is being embedded, reformatting our Canadian media system. Now, this story of artificial intelligence, I think we should be paying attention to, because I think it is a significant public policy decision. And that the story of this revolution, this AI, this revolution in deep learning, is one that both the Trudeau government and the Canadian state itself has invested heavily in, both rhetorically. And so here is Trudeau appearing, evangelizing Canadian researchers as part of the AI revolution, but also something that we've committed significant federal and provincial monies towards. And so Canada in the 2021 budget invested $443 million over the next 10 years to the development of AI research for the Pan-Canadian Artificial Intelligence Strategy. So this, I think, is a significant point of study, because if we're just talking about government investment, where in the ages, as the time has grown up in various epochs of austerity, where are the moments of investment? Where are the contributions? And I think it's quite clear that the Canadian state has dedicated significant public monies to the cultivation of artificial intelligence. And the cultivation of artificial intelligence is a Canadian industry. And I think more directly, as we'll talk on, with the idea that artificial intelligence is a solution. It's something that can advance, at least progressively branded liberal strategies. And this is just a quick academic aside, but one of the challenges then, I think this is one of the deeper challenges now that we're kind of facing. When I talk about artificial intelligence in the media system and in Canada's media system, it's hard to make sense of what that is anymore. How do we describe the changes that are taking place through this thing called artificial intelligence, and what's its object or target? And so in part, I'm influenced by the philosopher Timothy Morton, who uses the term hyperobjects to describe things so big that they're unimaginable. And that's a central tension with our research group. And we're trying to think about the impact or consequences of artificial intelligence in something called Canada's media system. What does that mean? What is Canada's media system? So one of the parts that we've tried to identify and make sense of is, where are we able to locate and think about the ways that artificial intelligence is making an impact on this thing that we may call the hyperobject of Canada's media or our media environments, our new infrastructures. And so credit goes to my MA student, Megan Wester, and our postdoctoral scholar, Sophie Tupin, for putting forward and designing one of the outputs of a group called Navigating the AI Stack, where a team of our research get together trying to think about how AI is changing our media systems. And what we did, drawing on feminist methodologies of situational analysis, as well as kind of moderation and workshop facilitation, was try to map out where and what are the kind of dynamics or tensions of AI in the kind of media stack, or what is the AI stack in Canada. And so for those interested in just talking about where these ideas are coming from, this is a collaborative effort. And here's kind of the results of that collaboration. This is the whiteboard where we are starting, or the blackboard actually, the blackboard where we are putting on our different concepts of trying to map this out. And through this emerged an approach of trying to think about what are these kind of frictions that we might attend to or make sense of. And so the relationship between what are kind of AI policies and AI controversies. And so the ways that we're both attending to the debates, contradict, the closures, as well as the controversies associated with artificial intelligence media systems, the ways, what are the infrastructures, where is it physically being located, data centers, and telecommunication systems, and pipelines on your phone, and what are the agencies then associated to artificial intelligence, filtering, content moderation, optimization, lowering carbon emissions. What are the agencies associated with artificial intelligence? How does artificial intelligence then change the time and space of these systems? And finally, from a political economic standpoint, well, who are the buyers and sellers? Who are the ones creating and who are the ones selling artificial intelligence? And it's through these tensions, not to say that we'll ever be able to account for a picture of this or have a whole, have a view from nowhere, so to speak, but be able to locate specifically what are the different vantage points that we might make sense of what's taking place. And so part of our project now is trying to identify what are these dots, but what are these moments that we might be able to start making sense of what's taking place in the AI stack. And what I'd like to do now is then start sharing some of these ways. Well, that's the actual link to those. What are the points of study AI as regulation? And this, I think, is kind of defining part of the presentation. Is when I say AI is regulation in media and policy studies, we often make a distinction between governance, policy, and regulation. And regulation is the thing that actually does or has the impact that is meant to implement or impose policy. And what I'm interested in is not then the ways that we might potentially govern or talk abstractly about artificial intelligence or AI ethics or these more kind of abstract philosophical debates about AI, but what are the ways that AI is being used presently? And how is that, those kind of tangible applications of AI, what are their consequences to matters that we might discuss, human rights, democracy, and I think, public participation, which is what I'd like to talk about next. So the first case I'd like to begin with is one that is about Bell AI. And the subject of this is less about Bell and more about the CRTC and how the CRTC, which is Canada's media regulator, the Canadian Radio, Television, and Telecommunications Commission, only took me a few years to be able to say that as quick as I can, and how it's responded to a proposal. So the story begins in July of 2019. When Bell Canada, our largest telecommunications company, submits an application, which is called a Part 1 application to the CRTC asking for approval. And what it hopes to do is that there's been an uptake, you might be affected by it, the spam calls and calls that are like unsolicited text messages, an uptick in these kind of unsolicited fraudulent calls. And the way to combat or address this issue is through what Bell proposes is artificial intelligence and machine learning, which is able to detect and stop these calls. Now, at first, the application seems relatively kind of benign, but it's important just to recognize the scope of this is that Bell's blocking would impact all calls that transit or terminate on our network. Now, that's important kind of telecommunications speak to just give you a sense of the scope of this application is that what Bell was proposing to do was be able to, monitor all calls that are being made, not only that are to Bell customers, but any customers or accounts that have to use Bell's network. And as we know from the kind of consolidation of the Canadian telecommunications market, this means that there is potentially affecting millions of callers and millions of phone calls. And so this case is one that I participated in the CRTC with myself and my colleague and close collaborator, Reza Rajapujan, and trying to unpack what's taking place and try to understand how is it that a discussion or debate about artificial intelligence might be regulated by our media commissioner. And it's, to my knowledge, the first active case of discussing artificial intelligence that the CRTC is considering. Now, this raises really interesting, fascinating questions. First, we're talking about buyers and suppliers. How is this technology being made? How is Bell doing it? What are the ways it's working? Infrastructures and agencies, this question of what does this mean if we start thinking about telecommunications, or our phone network is now something that's intelligent, monitoring our calls and making decisions about that, as well as time and space. How is it that this dynamic between catching spammers and catching spammers internationally is now being played out in these kind of microseconds of assessing risk or potential, potentially bad actors in telecommunication network? And then finally, how does this case become a moment of whether we see this as something that becomes controversial or largely settled, is that AI is seen as something that's relatively benign? And the case has been taking place for the past 2 years. So in 2019, Bell files the Part 1 application. In June the next year, it approves this application on a 90-day trial basis. Then a few months later, Bell had applied for a permanent application or permanent approval for the system. And this continues. And through our own contributions, Reza and myself have called for greater demands about how the system works, data about what providers are taking place, and also as well for folks who are kind of studying algorithmic AI governance in Canada, an algorithmic impact assessment to be conducted. So really trying to, through this process, to demand and require the CRTC to do its due diligence in assessing the system. And the CRTC claims and maintains that it has done this. But what has happened now at the end of the case is that the system has been improved. And so now on a permanent basis, all calls being made in Canada that are using Bell's network are potentially subject to an AI system. And the key take, and then what Bell has now subsequently done past that is also just this month entered into a strategic agreement with the Vector Institute to advance artificial intelligence research and application. So we see in some ways already the beginnings of consequences, I think, of this decision, where Bell has been legitimated to use its telecommunications network as a site of research and development into artificial intelligence, which I think raises kind of a numerous questions. The one I'd like to highlight and identify is a matter of accountability. And you can see it here is that through the course of the proceedings, what Rez and I were kind of expecting was a debate about whether the system would work, how would it work, what are the ways that it might or might not have a false positive. But what our intervention in the hearing largely devolved into was a debate about whether there's enough public data, public information for a decision to be able to be made and justified to the public. And over the course of the 2 hearings, what we found is that to be able to participate, we had to sign a non-disclosure agreement to be able to have access to confidential data. And then beyond that, that non-disclosure agreement was with Bell Canada, and that there was an ability of Bell, at least on its own part, to be able to public or describe how the system worked in public. So this is an example of what would be a public submission by Bell describing how its systems works. And so everything in yellow is information that's been filed in confidence to the CRTC. And so this first case of AI accountability and the kind of closure of this case, and the fact that it was closed without a threshold being met, the CRTC largely saying that this information could and should be left to be able to be disclosed only in confidence, raises, I think, the first concern I'd like to talk about in terms of the consequences of power after AI, which is this question of oversight. And I think one tension that we have quite centrally is that the CRTC understands it describes itself as a participatory democratic institution, one that encourages and even at the best of times funds, although that's becoming more difficult, public participation in proceedings. And the challenge that we see is that in this hearing, what the CRTC decided was that confidentiality and that a way that the AI system could be disclosed was something that could be left in public. And further to the point, the CRTC decided that there wasn't, as a quote, any need for regulatory framework regarding AI at this time. So if we're thinking about these kind of questions of controversies or closures, largely this was something that was settled without much public concern. But it raises a really fundamental question. If we are talking about, who can participate, what are the consequences of participation? This is one of the clauses from the non-disclosure agreement. The confidentiality, if we sign the non-disclosure agreement, which the resident myself refused to at a principle, is that we'd have to maintain the confidentiality of this information in perpetuity, which raises real questions about being able to participate and publicize and do the type of research I do. So it matters to academic freedom. But I think another and kind of more central point is what is the variability of artificial intelligence and the consequence of the bias it potentially creates if these systems are so risky that they can't be described in public, if their operation can't be explained for fear that bad actors might get a hold of it, which is often what we are told by Bell and also legitimated by the CRTC, then what is the consequence of that technology for democratic oversight? How can we think about the ways that we invite and maintain, kind of fantasy of public participation in media policy when we're investing in technologies by their very design refute and negate that ability for the public to participate or understand how these systems work, and that our media regulator itself has largely legitimated that system of confidentiality and non-disclosure. And so this raises, I think, the first concern I have about artificial intelligence is how does it find its responsibility, and is there potentially an anti-democratic risk in artificial intelligence itself and in new technologies that require for their operation to work, the fact that they can't be understood by the general public. The second issue I'd like to bring up is a matter that's before Canada, which is this term we're also going to talk about is online harms. Now, it's been a minute, but we had an election in 2021. And during that election, the incumbent and successful Liberal Party of Canada made a commitment to protect Canadians from a term called online harms. And for comparative policy scholars, this term online harms is something that comes from the United Kingdom. And the sense and the concern is quite rightly, there's a worry about the regulation of social media content and the concern that hate speech, particularly technologically facilitated violence against women, as well as kind of rising concerns of Islamophobia, are something that's being amplified through social media. And what the government is in the process of doing is developing legislation that would target 5 kinds of harmful content online. And this is being in a bill put forward known as online harm. So 5 types of problematic content. And I would say that this kind of why these are put together is something that kind of critics have kind of rightly pointed out. Is like, how do you bundle together these very 5 different types of societal harms and put them together in one coherent package? But the problem, what I'd like to draw attention to, is that in the proposal for this document, which I'll just say here, so just to give you a walkthrough. So just before the election, the government in July 29th put forward an online consultation to hear about online harms. This happened during the election, so a very strange period of consultation. The Liberals are commit to this, and the period of consultation closes during the election. And then on February of this year, they released a What We Heard report. Now, part of the feedback, and what's important, is that there was a support for a majority of respondents for a legislatory and regulatory framework led by the federal government to confront harmful content online. So the government's own interpretation of what was said is largely beginning to legitimate its regulatory agenda. One of the discussions and key points of contestation is that the online harms discussion paper suggested that regulated entities would be required to take down this kind of 5 types of harmful contents within 24 hours of being flagged. And the fast pace they suggest could be solved for the use of automated systems based on algorithms. Now, we presently know that most social media platforms, when dealing with their societal impacts, prefer to find the solutions through automated means. And this is, I think, a central question that we have now in kind of media policy, media governance. It's not a question of how to deal with, or the kind of how to deal with online harms more broadly, but what's being put forward as artificial intelligence as the fix for these things. And so there's a delegation of social responsibility to automation, and that automation can deal with, and I think this is something I'll talk about, how is automation itself is seen to be the way that we can solve deep structural issues, systemic issues, that are the consequence of working in a deeply unjust, kind of damaged society. And how is it that that fix is, and what is that fix being proposed? And so Facebook, for the large part, describes what it's doing to combat hate speech, is that it has developed classifiers that are able to kind of automatically flag and take down hate speech content. Now, the Online Harms Bill is an opportunity in some ways to call into question these kind of automated mechanisms, both for their effectiveness and for the legitimacy for, I think, quite rightly, very real problems in our society. How do we address and move forward with them? But what the opportunity is being missed presently is that the online harms proposal is suggesting that rather than calling into question, we're trying to hold to account how these automated AI systems might work or not work. What is happening is that effectively this need for a rapid response is legitimating these particular systems as the only means of responding to these types of problems. And so this is something which I think speaks to a second concern of potential harm with the kind of use of artificial intelligence as a solution to media problems, is this idea that what we are putting forward is, and this is building on the work of Wendy Brown, a walled strategy of trying to block or remove or filter content and create more and more increasingly safe online spaces that extricate, much like the process of gentrification, platforms and certain online communities from the societies in which they exist and operate. And so how as automation and filtering, in fact, something that might exacerbate or amplify the problem itself by thinking that the way of doing it is through an automated fix or a technological solution rather than deeper, more structural or coordinated reforms, which I think speaks to the kind of fundamental framing issue of the Online Harms Bill, as though these 5 issues are ones that can be addressed as a basket, but whether they might actually be separate concerns that demand their own kind of inquiries and particular attention that understand and situate technology solutions within a wider range of policy responses. And so my second point and final point is then this question of, can automation solve for social responsibility? And what are the consequences of positioning artificial intelligence as this fix, as a way of automatically triaging and treating issues of content and also as kind of media problems more generally? And so these 2 points are what I'd like to highlight as some of the potential consequences of what we describe as power after AI. And so how is it that this turn towards, and I think quite significantly, investment in artificial intelligence is leading to an increased concerns about public oversight and awareness, explainability, as you can see in the Bell AI case. And secondly, a concern about solutionism, or the ways that we continue to allow a technology to stand in for fixes for deeper structural, technological, deeper structural societal issues. And I say that wanted to kind of point on these because I think what's really central for me, and one of the traditions that I want to keep alive and keep going in the field of communication policy in Canada, is that communication policy in Canada is interventionary, it's engaged, and that these 2 stories aren't ones that are settled yet, and that consultations are going and your voice matters. And so one point is to be aware of the reforms to online harms that will be coming down the pipe, as well as to greater scrutiny at the CRTC for algorithms, because both of these are potential moments of public participation, oversight, and really for public participation to ensure that these stories that AI is something that's necessarily a fix or a solution aren't ones to taken for granted, and that there's greater scrutiny of the massive public investments that's being done for technologies that have, through my own research, clear and demonstrable risks about power and accountability. And so I want to end there and say thank you very much. Hopefully you found that interesting. If folks are interested, these are some of the places I work. And I would like to thank this research is supported by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. So with that, I'll end it there, and I'm looking forward to discussion and questions. So hopefully we have some more time.
Thank you for the very interesting talk, Fenwick. I am going to stop the recording just so that we can have a more free discussion if folks feel more free that way. So I'm just going to do